Harja. Hey y'all. Today I'm going to talk to you about a project that Fáilte Farm Fungi was hired for. If you've seen much of our Instagram, you know that we work on hedges over the summer, so we have lots of stories to tell you about those kinds of jobs. Now, a couple of years back, a vengeful neighbor had their son-in-law take out their anger on this person's hedge because it was supposedly blocking the sunlight from hitting their yard. They took a chainsaw to the hedge opposite from their side and maimed the trees. I won't get into all the legal disputes that the neighbors have been in since then, but my mission yesterday was to begin trimming their hedge at an angle so that one side has privacy and the other side has sunlight. This hedge runs from east to west, and the sun sits in the southern sky throughout the year, so setting a higher top on the southern side and a lower top on the northern side should allow an adequate amount of sunlight over the hedge. Since the hedge was thrown outward when it was chopped down, the first year we spent was dedicated to making clean cuts along the branches so that the hedge would survive its mauling. The damage was quite drastic, so we did our best with what we had. You can still see the scars in some of the stumps and branches, and the eastern side of the hedge has a lump on it that I need to bring out the loppers and chainsaw for on another day. Even though it's uneven, starting a bit lower than what we actually want eventually will lead to a fuller and more verdant hedge in the future. We do still have to take the branches on the southern side back about a foot or so. It won't look pretty for a couple years, but given the amount of sunlight and the water it receives, it should spring back relatively quickly in the grand scheme of things. When cutting hedges to try to fill them in, we make sure to cut the tips off as many branchlets as possible because it encourages the tree to create a fork where it was damaged. If we treat the tree like a hydra year after year, it'll grow itself a nice barrier of foliage, like the staircase hedge I've made here. As you can see, the vertical northern face of the hedge is green and full, as the neighbor's son-in-law didn't attack that part of the hedge. Before it was chopped, the hedge was a staircase of a 6-foot hedge on the northern side and a 10-foot hedge on the southern side. It was boxy and looked akin to a couch. Now, however, the mission is to create an angle, as I've been saying. Because the hedge is so wide in its current state, I was balancing myself on top of the flattened leads inside the hedge, checking carefully everywhere I was stepping so I wouldn't break any branches. It was tough going and I earned a bunch of scratches from the cypress's spikes, but it was worth it to be able to walk through the hedge, because my ladder was not going to be able to reach that. At one point, where the hedge was extremely thin, I crawled down into the hedge from one tree and climbed up another. There used to be a path between the yards there years ago, but both neighbors decided to let it fill in and abandon the path for privacy's sake. Since then, they've been letting it fill in, and it's sparse, especially since there's a plum tree blocking direct sunlight, but it'll fill in over time. All the planning was left up to me, so I decided to work on making stair steps on either side of the angled hedge as a border between the angled hedge and the taller hedges surrounding them. The eastern stair step was more smoothly going than the western stair step because the eastern step is shaded only by an aspen tree, while the western step is shaded by the plum tree that I mentioned earlier. These will also take a few years to fill in properly, given their shading and how damaged the trees were, but they'll get there eventually. Now, in terms of the angle, I didn't measure it out with a protractor, but made an estimation based on the sun's position in the sky over the course of the year. I tried to choose an angle that, as I mentioned before, would allow the southern neighbor privacy while providing sunlight to the northern neighbor. The angle is somewhere around 30 degrees, but it isn't flush. There were many areas with holes and other areas with thicker leaves that need to be taken down with chainsaw or loppers. And given the state of the hedge, I made some executive decisions and repositioned some trimmed branches by hand so that they might grow in thicker and get rid of the holes. Or I trimmed some thicker branches extra far back because they would become problems in the future. If I were to cut thicker branches at the same length or the same height as the fronds, they would grow to stick out of the hedge. Leaving the branches in would cause an unsightly bump in an otherwise flush hedge years to come. So to take care of this in the future, we would either have to let it be and allow it to be a bump, or cut it back and create an even more unsightly hole than was originally there. So it's better just to take care of it now. All in all, making this angle and cutting this side of the hedge took about 3.5 hours. There's still more work to be done, so I estimate another 3 hours of work in this hedge to care for the southern side and to cut the branches back a couple feet. Luckily for me, there weren't any bees or hornets' nests in the hedge, They've been a problem in other hedges, and I wear a bee suit when necessary. When I'm in the bee suit, things tend to take longer because my visibility is limited more than normal, and my range of motion is also pretty limited. I also have a harder time dealing with the heat in the bee suit because it's very stuffy, especially when it's 90 degrees outside with stagnant air, no breeze. But in other news, we saved a sunflower the other night. The property owners called me around 9 p.m. and asked for my help in making a splint for a sunflower that had snapped under its own weight. The process was simple, but took a lot of reaching and straining to get that splint right. The sunflower, which is about 10 feet tall, is right up against the house. We didn't have to worry about the foundation, but there are water lines running underneath the dirt in which the sunflowers stand. So what we did was get a long bamboo stick and an orchard ladder and use a post driver to slam that bamboo stick into the ground about a foot. After that, I made and tied a splint around where the sunflower had snapped to hold it up straight. I had to cut off one of its leaves, but one leaf versus the entire plant was a trade that I was willing to make. I tied the splint in 3 different places in order to fasten it securely. One or two ties wouldn't have been sufficient for making the splint hold fast, so I started with the middle splint, then the bottom splint, then the top. After I'd tied the splint in place, I tied the entire thing to the long bamboo stick I'd post holed from the ground. 3 days later, when I checked in on it, as you can see here, even though the lower leaves were wilting, the upper leaves and the flower itself seems to be just as good as it has been before the breakage. Now, if you have a plant or specifically a sunflower that is snapped, but it doesn't seem like the xylem and phloem have been damaged, you can make a splint for it. If you do this immediately, you should be able to save the plant. Like everything else, though, the longer you wait, the worse your chances are going to be. I hope some of that inspires you to learn about how plants grow and react to damage a bit more. If you have any questions or comments, feel free to make a comment below or visit our homepage at fáiltefarmfungi.org. So long live, agus go raibh maith agaibh.